Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode. So in the last episode we made a staging buffer, and that was to optimize the transfer of data into the vertex buffer. So this episode we're going to make another buffer. It's called an index buffer. And the point of this is to avoid having to store the same vertex multiple times. So here's an example. If you'll notice here, we have two triangles that are making up a rectangle, or a quad. And the important thing here is that each triangle has three vertices, but since they're going to be lined up together, as they are shown here, they're going to end up sharing vertices. So the first triangle we have on top here would be made up of vertex 0, 1, and 2. And the one down here would be made up of vertex 2, 3, and 0. And it's silly to store all of that data for both triangles. We'd end up having to store 6 vertices when we really only need 4. And as you have a larger 3D model, you'll end up reusing vertices even more so, and it would end up wasting a lot of memory. So what we do is we actually create an index buffer, and that will store the indices of these vertices. And then rather than storing all of the vertices that make up a triangle, we just store the indices of the vertices that it uses, and then we can reuse them later on. Now we wouldn't need the data for each of these vertices, like the position. We would just store that this triangle is made up of index 0, 1, and 2, and it'll be able to retrieve all of that data. So later on, when we make the second triangle, if we reuse vertex 2 and 0, again, it can just go to that same index in our vertex buffer and get the data for that particular vertex. Let's go ahead and get right into it. We're going to do exactly what I showed in that diagram. We're going to take what we had before with that triangle, and we're going to change it so that now we're going to produce two triangles that create a rectangle. So first we're going to go to our vertex buffer right here, and I know I've named this vertex buffer, but I'm going to add all the code for the index buffer in here since it associates so directly with the vertex buffer. I might decide that that was the wrong choice later on and move things around, but at least it's a good place for it for the moment. So before we do anything here, let's go ahead and change our vertices. The ones that we have hard-coded aren't going to work anymore because this is just 3 vertices and it'll create a single triangle. We need 4. So let's go ahead and change that. Alright, so let's go ahead and change these vertices. So we're just going to make a 4th one right here. Make sure that has a comma. So works out alright. And we want all of these to be at the corners. So this one that's at 0.0 and then negative 0.5, that's the one that was at the center of the triangle, and we want these to be right triangles. So we're going to change this to 0.5. And the one right up here we're going to change to 2 negative 0.5s for both x, and one for x, one for y. So that should give us all the corners. And let's make this one let's see what we have for colors here. We'll go ahead and change, this is the new one, we'll do this one maybe all, yeah, we'll do it like that. Okay, so that should give us 4 vertices, which should make up a rectangle. And now we need the indices of everything. So like I said before, we're going to actually have to designate the indices for each triangle. So we're going to make a new const vector, and this is going to be of uint32t, and we'll just call it indices. And we're just going to kind of line this up the same way we did the previous one with the vertices, except there's less data to contain, so it's a little bit easier. And this one we're just going to have 0, 1, and 2 for the first triangle, and then 2, 3, 0 for the second triangle. So that'll give us all the indices that we need. Now we need a way of creating the vertex and index. I'm sorry, we already created the vertex buffer. We need a way of creating the index buffer, and we also need a way of getting the data for it. So right underneath the create function and the cleanup function. In fact, we could probably just copy and paste these and then fill out anything additional that needs to be done. So I'm going to call this create index buffer, and this is going to be cleanup index buffer. Alright, so that looks pretty good. Now we also need down here, we made a VK buffer and VK device memory for the vertex buffer and its memory. We need the same thing for the index buffer, so we're going to do VK buffer, index buffer, and we're also going to have VK device memory. There we go, and that's going to be index buffer memory. Okay, and now that we have those, of course, we need a way of getting that information in other locations. So right here under the getters section, we're just going to do VK buffer pointer get index buffer. Oops. Alright, and then we are going to return the index buffer. Sorry, a reference to the index buffer. And once again, we're going to do uint 32t get indices size, and then return, and it's just going to be indices dot size, like that. Alright, now we need to define the create index buffer and clean up index buffer function, so we're going to grab these. And we're going to go right over here to the CPP file and drop those in. Let's give them some brackets and make sure we get the scope. Okay. So now these are going to be built rather similar to the way the vertex buffer was, with some minor changes. So we're just going to go right up here, copy some things. So we're just going to grab cleanup buffer right here, drop that into cleanup index buffer, and we just need to change it to the index buffer and the index buffer memory. Index buffer memory. Weird. It wasn't auto-completing that for some reason. We do have it, right? Oh, it's because I misspelled it. There we go. Okay, so that should cover cleaning up the index buffer. And right here, for create index buffer, we're just going to copy everything from the vertex buffer create function, and drop it in there, and then change a few things to make it work. Alright. So first off, the size of is going to be indices and indices.size. So it'll give us the proper buffer size. Staging buffer should be the same. Everything we have here, I believe, is the same. Yep. Okay, go through all this. When we actually create the buffer, this is going to be a little different. This should be, obviously, index buffer. This should be index buffer memory. And I believe we need to switch one of these flags. Yes, okay, so right here, VK buffer usage vertex buffer bit. This is not a vertex buffer, this is an index buffer. So we just do VK buffer usage index buffer bit. There we go. And that looks like everything we need there. Just make sure. Yeah, I believe that's everything. I might have missed something, and if so, I'll come back and fix it in a moment. But hopefully that should cover everything we need. And then up here in the constructor, we went ahead and created the vertex buffer. Directly after that, let's just go ahead and call create index buffer. So it'll automatically be created anytime we construct a new vertex buffer. And we can just grab all this, since it expects the same arguments, drop them right in there. And that should cover everything we need for our index buffer. Now we need to go over to our actual engine code and make sure that everything is handled properly for the index buffer. So if we hop over here to planetvulkan.cpp, here's where the vertex buffer is cleaned up. We're going to also need to call cleanup on the index buffer, and since everything is cleaned up in reverse order, we're going to want to call cleanup on the index buffer before we call cleanup on the vertex buffer. So we're just going to do vertex buffer cleanup index buffer. That is kind of a confusing name. I will probably have to change that down the line. Pass the logical device. Okay, so that should clean that up nicely. And we're also going to need to bind the index buffer. So let's go ahead and take care of that. So from here we need to go to our create command buffers function. So let's just find that real quick. Here we go. Alright, and if we go down a little bit. Alright, so here's where we bind the vertex buffers. Now we're going to need to bind the index buffer as well. So we're going to just we'll do it right here. So we're just going to do vk buffer index buffer, and that's going to equal, we're going to get our vertex buffer object and call get index buffer. So now we have a handle to that, and now we're going to call vk command bind index buffer, and we just pass in command buffers I, like we did for the index. I'm sorry, like we did for the vertex buffer. And then we're going to do a, what else does it expect here? The buffer itself, so we just do index buffer. The offset, which is going to be 0. And then the index type, which is going to be vk index type uint32. There we go. And we're also going to need to change the draw function, because now we're drawing using an index buffer. We're not just going through all of our vertices, because you'll notice this was going through the entire vertex buffer before. So we're actually going to completely get rid of the vk command draw, and we're going to replace that with vk command draw indexed. Alright, and we're just going to pass in command buffers. Need to make that plural. There we go. Command buffers, static cast uint32t, and this is going to be vertex buffer, and we're going to get the indices size. So now we have the proper size. Oops, that goes here. And I also spelled uint32 wrong, so there we go. And now, let's see, what do we need next? Just, you're not really working with me here, are you? Okay, we need the instance count, which is 1. The first index, which is 0. The vertex offset, which is 0. And the first instance, which is 0. So that should do everything we need. And actually, I realized something that we forgot. If we go back over here to the vertex buffer when I was creating the index buffer, this is the danger of copying and pasting. The memcopy call that I'm doing is copying vertices data. That's not what we want. We want indices data. Alright. I really do think that's everything. Oh, nope. Missed another one. This is right here for copy buffer. We want the index buffer. This is definitely why you don't want to copy and paste too often, if you can avoid it. Alright, so I think that's everything. Let's try running this, and hopefully everything will work the way we want. Let's see what outcome we get. Give it a second here. Any minute now. Doesn't look like we got any errors, so that's probably a good sign. Alright, there's our window, and there you have it. So we have a nice rectangle here now. Everything worked out pretty nicely. And so it should be reusing those indices so that we don't have to actually pass in enough data for every single triangle. We just need to make sure that we pass in enough indices for it to get vertices that it can create a triangle from. Alright, so that's everything we needed to do. So that's all for this episode. Sorry it was kind of a short one, but I didn't want to get into the next stuff because we're going to be doing uniform buffer objects, and I'd rather do that all in one episode than split it up into two. So thanks for watching, and if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments.